My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'll never forget the moment Robert Chen looked me straight in the eye at our anniversary dinner and said, "Honestly, David, you could do so much better than her. Your wife clearly doesn't understand the tech world like we do." He laughed as he cut into his steak, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he was dismissing had just closed a $12 million deal with his biggest rival that morning. 3 years of building my secret company in the shadows was about to pay off in the most spectacular way possible. But that night, I just smiled politely and excused myself to the restroom, where I nearly threw up from the rage boiling inside me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Robert didn't know, what my own husband didn't even know, was that I was the CEO of Innovate Tech Labs, the company that had been systematically stealing his most valuable clients for the past 18 months. Tomorrow night at the Austin Tech Summit, I would step onto that stage and reveal exactly who had been outmaneuvering TechFlow Solutions at every turn. The look on his face would be worth every sleepless night, every lie I had to tell, and every moment I questioned whether I was losing my mind trying to prove that the housewife he dismissed was actually his most formidable competitor. The story begins 3 years earlier in our suburban home in Cedar Park, where I spent my days managing our household while David built his digital marketing consultancy from our converted garage. We had been married for 5 years, and I genuinely loved supporting his entrepreneurial dreams, even when it meant stretching our savings thin and eating ramen for dinner more nights than I care to remember. David was brilliant at what he did, creating marketing campaigns that transformed struggling startups into profitable businesses, but he had one major blind spot that would eventually create the perfect storm for what was to come. He never took my business ideas seriously. Not in a cruel way, mind you. David wasn't deliberately dismissive or unkind. He would listen to my suggestions about his clients' strategies, nod thoughtfully, and then proceed to do exactly what he had planned from the beginning. When I pointed out potential improvements to his proposals or suggested alternative approaches, he would pat my hand affectionately and say something like, "That's sweet, honey, but this is pretty technical stuff." It was the kind of casual dismissal that chips away at your confidence one conversation at a time until you start to question whether your ideas have any value at all. The worst part was that David genuinely believed he was being protective and loving. In his mind, he was shielding me from the harsh realities of the business world, keeping me safe from the stress and pressure that consumed his daily life. He would often tell his friends how lucky he was to have a wife who didn't need to worry about work, who could focus on making our home a peaceful sanctuary. What he didn't realize was that I was slowly suffocating in that sanctuary, watching opportunities pass by while my brain went unused, and my ambitions withered away. Robert Chen entered our lives about 6 months into David's business journey, and from the very first meeting, I knew he was going to be trouble. TechFlow Solutions was David's first major client, and Robert never let either of us forget it. He had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a favor he was doing for us, as if David should be grateful for the privilege of working 16-hour days to make Robert's company more profitable. But what really got under my skin was how he treated me whenever he came to our house for dinner meetings. Robert would arrive in his Tesla wearing a suit that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment, and he would greet me with the kind of patronizing smile usually reserved for children and pets. He would compliment our cute little house and make jokes about how domestic I looked in my apron, as if being a supportive wife was somehow quaint and amusing. During business discussions, he would direct all his questions to David, even when they were about aspects of the marketing strategy that I had actually developed during our private conversations at home. The breaking point came during a barbecue we hosted for several of David's clients about 18 months into their business relationship. I had spent the entire day preparing food and making sure everything was perfect, but I had also spent the previous week researching each client's business challenges and developing some preliminary ideas for how David's services could better address their needs. I was excited to finally participate in the business discussions instead of just serving drinks and refilling plates. When the conversation turned to TechFlow's struggles with customer retention, I mentioned that I had noticed some patterns in their user feedback that suggested their onboarding process might be creating confusion rather than clarity. I had spent hours analyzing their customer support tickets and had identified several specific pain points that could be addressed with relatively simple changes to their user interface design. It was solid research backed by real data, and I was proud of the insights I had uncovered. Robert listened to my entire presentation with a bemused expression, occasionally glancing at David as if they shared some private joke. When I finished explaining my analysis, there was a moment of silence that felt like it lasted forever. Then Robert chuckled and said, "Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective from someone who's never actually run a software company." He turned to David and added, "You're lucky to have such an engaged wife, but maybe leave the business strategy to those of us who actually understand the industry." The humiliation burned through me like acid. Not just because Robert had dismissed my ideas without consideration, but because David said nothing. He didn't defend my research or point out that my suggestions were actually quite insightful. He just laughed along with Robert and changed the subject to something safer, something that wouldn't require him to choose between supporting his wife and maintaining his most important client relationship. That night, after all the guests had gone home and David was snoring peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to prove that I understood the tech industry better than Robert Chen ever would, but I was going to do it in a way that he would never see coming. I wasn't going to argue with him or try to convince David to take me seriously. I was going to build my own company, compete directly with TechFlow Solutions, and take their clients one by one until Robert finally understood exactly who he had been underestimating all these years. The next morning, I started researching everything I could find about TechFlow's business model, their client base, and their competitive landscape. I discovered that while Robert's company had been successful, they had become complacent and slow to adapt to changing market conditions. Their software solutions were still functional, but they lacked the innovation and user-friendly design that newer companies were offering.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
More importantly, their customer service was notoriously poor, and their pricing structure hadn't been updated in years to reflect the value they actually provided. I saw an opportunity to create something better, something that would address all the gaps I had identified in TechFlow's approach. But I also knew that building a competing company while married to Robert's marketing consultant would require a level of secrecy and strategic planning that would test every limit of my creativity and endurance. I would have to build this business entirely in the shadows, using resources and connections that David knew nothing about, all while maintaining the facade of being the supportive housewife that everyone expected me to be. The first step was finding a co-founder who could handle the technical development while I focused on strategy and business development. Through a series of networking events that I attended under the pretense of making friends, I met Emma Rodriguez, a software engineer who had recently been laid off from a major tech company and was looking for her next opportunity. Emma was brilliant, ambitious, and frustrated with the male-dominated culture of most tech companies. When I explained my vision for a more innovative and customer-focused alternative to existing solutions, she was immediately interested. We agreed to meet regularly at a coffee shop called Brew and Bites in East Austin, far enough from David's usual haunts that we wouldn't accidentally run into anyone who might ask awkward questions. Our cover story was that Emma was teaching me basic coding skills as a hobby, which provided the perfect explanation for why I was suddenly spending several hours a week away from home. David thought it was adorable that I was trying to learn about his world, and he would often joke about how I might be able to help him with simple website updates once I got the hang of HTML. Those early meetings with Emma were intoxicating in a way I hadn't experienced since college. For the first time in years, I was having conversations about complex problems that required creative solutions, strategic thinking, and deep analysis. Emma would explain the technical aspects of different development approaches, while I would outline the business case for various features and map out potential customer segments. We complemented each other perfectly, and within a few weeks we had developed a comprehensive plan for building a software platform that would directly compete with TechFlow's core offerings. The challenge was funding our development without raising suspicions at home. I couldn't exactly ask David for startup capital to build a company that would directly compete with his biggest client, and I didn't have enough personal savings to bootstrap the entire project myself. The solution came from an unexpected source: my grandmother's jewelry collection, which she had left to me when she passed away 2 years earlier. I had been keeping it in a safety deposit box, uncertain about what to do with pieces that held sentimental value but didn't really fit my lifestyle. Selling my grandmother's jewelry felt like a betrayal at first, but as I held her diamond engagement ring up to the light in the bank vault, I realized that she would have understood what I was trying to do. She had been a businesswoman herself in an era when that was far more difficult than it is today, and she had always encouraged me to be independent and self-reliant. The jewelry collection was worth about $40,000, which would be enough to cover Emma's salary for several months and pay for the basic infrastructure we needed to get started. I told David that I had decided to sell the jewelry because I never wore it and wanted to put the money into our joint savings account for future investments. He was supportive of the decision, especially since it meant we would have more financial security while his business was still growing. What he didn't know was that the money went directly into a separate business account that I had opened under my maiden name, with all statements being sent to a private mailbox that I rented specifically for Innovate Tech Labs correspondence. While Emma worked on developing our minimum viable product, I threw myself into market research with the intensity of someone whose entire sense of self-worth depended on proving a point. I analyzed every aspect of TechFlow's business, from their pricing strategies to their customer acquisition methods to their retention rates. I studied their competitors, identified gaps in the market that no one was adequately addressing, and developed a comprehensive understanding of what small and medium-sized businesses really needed from their software solutions. The more I learned, the more confident I became that we could build something significantly better than what TechFlow was offering. Their software was functional but clunky, their user interface was outdated and confusing, and their customer support was essentially non-existent. They had succeeded primarily because they were early to market and had built relationships with key clients before better alternatives existed, but they had become lazy and complacent about innovation. Our strategy was to focus on everything that TechFlow did poorly: intuitive design, responsive customer service, flexible pricing options, and regular updates based on user feedback. We would target the same customer segments but offer a superior experience at competitive prices. Most importantly, we would be nimble and adaptive in ways that a larger, more established company simply couldn't match. The development process took longer than I had anticipated, mainly because we were working with limited resources and couldn't afford to hire additional team members until we had proven our concept. Emma was essentially building the entire platform herself, while working part-time consulting gigs to pay her bills, and I was managing all the business development, marketing strategy, and customer research, while maintaining my cover as a devoted housewife. The stress of living a double life was more intense than I had expected. Every conversation with David required careful consideration of what I could and couldn't reveal about how I was spending my time. When he asked about my day, I had to remember which version of events I had already shared and make sure my stories remained consistent. When Robert came over for dinner meetings, I had to sit there listening to him complain about competitors and market challenges, knowing that I was actively working to become one of those competitors he was worried about. The closest I came to being discovered was about 8 months into the development process, when David found some technical documentation that I had been reviewing at home. He picked up the papers from our kitchen table and started reading through the specifications for database architecture and user authentication protocols. My heart stopped as I watched him flip through pages of detailed technical plans that were far beyond anything a hobbyist coder would need to understand. "This is pretty advanced stuff," he said, looking confused. "I thought Emma was just teaching you basic HTML and CSS. I felt my face flush as I struggled to come up with a plausible explanation that wouldn't raise further suspicions. "Oh, that's just some example code she showed me to help me understand how professional development projects are structured," I said, trying to sound casual. "I probably won't need to understand." Whoa. She thought it would be good context for learning the basics. David nodded and handed the papers back to me, but I could see a flicker of curiosity in his eyes that made me realize I needed to be much more careful about what materials I brought home. From that point forward, all Innovate Tech Labs work stayed in the small office space I had rented in a co-working facility in East Austin, where I could work without worrying about accidentally leaving evidence where David might find it. By the end of our first year, Emma and I had developed a functional beta version of our platform that addressed all the major shortcomings we had identified in TechFlow's offerings. Our user interface was clean and intuitive, our customer onboarding process was streamlined and helpful, and our core functionality was more robust and reliable than anything Robert's company was currently providing. We were ready to start testing with real customers, but we needed to find initial clients who would be willing to try a new solution from an unknown company. The breakthrough came when I attended a small business networking event in downtown Austin, where I met several entrepreneurs who were frustrated with their current software solutions but couldn't afford the expensive alternatives being offered by larger companies. I was careful not to mention my connection to David or his relationship with TechFlow, presenting myself simply as a tech entrepreneur who was developing more affordable and user-friendly business software. Our first client was a local accounting firm that had been struggling with TechFlow's invoicing and client management system for over a year. The owner, Michael Thompson, was desperate for something that would actually work the way his business needed it to work, and he was willing to take a chance on our platform in exchange for a significant discount and the promise that we would customize features based on his specific requirements. Working with Michael's firm was exactly the validation we needed to prove that our approach was correct. Within 2 weeks of implementing our system, his team was processing invoices faster, managing client communications more effectively, and spending far less time on technical troubleshooting. Michael was so impressed with the results that he agreed to serve as a reference for other potential customers and even invested $10,000 in our company to help fund further development. Word spread quickly through Austin's small business community about this new software platform that actually delivered on its promises. We gained 3 more clients within a month, each bringing their own specific needs and challenges that helped us refine and improve our offerings. Emma and I were working around the clock to keep up with demand, but the positive feedback and growing revenue proved that we were building something genuinely valuable. The most satisfying moment came about 15 months into our journey, when I learned through David's dinner conversation that TechFlow had lost 2 major clients to a mysterious new competitor that Robert couldn't identify. He was furious about the defections and was pressuring David to help him figure out where these clients had gone and what this new company was offering that TechFlow wasn't. I listened to their strategic planning sessions with barely contained glee, offering sympathetic comments about how difficult it must be to compete with unknown rivals, while secretly planning our next moves to steal even more of Robert's business. The irony was that David was actually quite helpful in our competitive intelligence gathering, though he had no idea he was doing it. His frustration with Robert's demands for market research meant that he would often come home complaining about TechFlow's weaknesses and the specific ways they were failing to meet customer needs. Every criticism David shared became an opportunity for Emma and me to develop features that directly address those pain points, making our platform an even more attractive alternative for dissatisfied TechFlow customers. As Innovate Tech Labs continued to grow, I found myself living in 2 completely different worlds that couldn't have been more contradictory. At home, I was still the supportive wife who listened patiently to David's work stress and offered encouraging words when Robert made unreasonable demands. But during my secret work hours, I was the CEO of a rapidly growing company that was systematically dismantling Robert's competitive position, 1 client at a time. The psychological toll of maintaining this double life was more intense than I had anticipated, but it was also strangely empowering. Every day that I successfully managed both identities was proof that I was capable of far more than anyone had given me credit for, including myself. I was building something meaningful and profitable while maintaining a marriage and household, all without anyone suspecting that the woman they saw as a passive support system was actually orchestrating one of the most successful competitive campaigns in Austin's tech scene. The first real warning sign that Robert Chen would become my greatest adversary came during what should have been a celebration. David had just landed 3 new clients in a single week, a personal record that put his consultancy on track to double its revenue within the year. I had suggested we invite Robert and his wife Monica to dinner as a way of thanking him for the referrals that had led to 2 of those new contracts. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to show gratitude, while also demonstrating that our little household was becoming more sophisticated and successful. I spent the entire day preparing what I thought would be an impressive meal, researching wine pairings, and creating a menu that would rival any upscale restaurant in Austin. Monica Chen was known for her refined taste and her involvement in several high-society charity organizations, and I wanted to prove that I could hold my own in their social circle. I had even bought a new dress for the occasion, something elegant but not too flashy, hoping to strike the right balance between showing respect for our guests and demonstrating that we were worthy of their continued partnership. The evening started well enough. Robert and Monica arrived precisely on time, bearing an expensive bottle of wine and compliments about our home's improvements since their last visit. Monica seemed genuinely impressed with the appetizers I had prepared, and Robert was unusually animated as he described some of the exciting projects TechFlow was developing. For the first hour, I felt like we were finally being accepted as equals, rather than treated as the junior partners in this relationship. But as the wine flowed and the conversation became more relaxed, Robert's true personality began to emerge. He started making casual comments about how lucky David was to have such a dedicated wife who could focus entirely on making their home comfortable while he concentrated on building his business. On the surface, these seemed like compliments, but there was an underlying assumption that my role was purely supportive and that I had no independent ambitions or capabilities beyond domestic management. When Monica asked what I did to keep myself busy during the day, I mentioned that I had been taking some online courses in business analysis and had been helping David research potential strategies for his clients. It was a carefully crafted response that acknowledged my intellectual interests while still positioning them as secondary to my primary role as a supportive spouse. I thought it struck the right tone of modest ambition without threatening anyone's assumptions about traditional relationship dynamics. Robert's reaction was immediate and dismissive. He laughed in a way that made it clear he found my educational pursuits amusing rather than admirable, and then launched into a lengthy explanation of why business strategy required years of hands-on experience that couldn't be replicated through academic study. According to Robert, the kind of analysis that mattered in real business situations could only be developed through direct exposure to high-stakes decision-making and complex client relationships. "It's sweet that you're interested in David's work," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "but the kind of strategic thinking we do at TechFlow requires a deep understanding of market dynamics that you just can't get from online courses. It's not a criticism of your intelligence, it's just that this industry has a learning curve that takes years to master, and even then, only certain types of minds are really suited for it." The implication was crystal clear. In Robert's worldview, I was fundamentally incapable of understanding the complexities of business strategy, not because I lacked education or experience, but because I lacked the right type of mind. It wasn't even personal in his estimation. It was simply a fact of nature that some people were built for strategic thinking and others were built for supportive roles. The casual certainty with which he dismissed my potential was more insulting than any direct attack could have been. David's response to this exchange was what truly broke something inside me. Instead of defending my intelligence or pointing out that my suggestions had actually improved several of his client proposals, he simply nodded along with Robert's assessment and redirected the conversation to safer topics. In that moment, I realized that my own husband had accepted Robert's evaluation of my capabilities and saw nothing problematic about his client's dismissive attitude toward his wife. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation, but I was no longer really present. Part of my mind was cataloging every additional slight and dismissive comment, while another part was already beginning to formulate the outlines of a plan that would prove exactly how wrong both of these men were about my strategic capabilities. By the time Robert and Monica left that evening, I had made a decision that would ultimately reshape not just my own life, but the entire competitive landscape of Austin's business software industry. The weeks following that dinner were filled with increasingly obvious signs that Robert viewed me as an obstacle to his deepening business relationship with David. He began scheduling more frequent meetings at TechFlow's offices rather than our home, claiming that it would be more professional and efficient to meet in a proper conference room environment. When David suggested that I might join them for some of these meetings, to take notes or provide research support, Robert politely but firmly explained that their discussions often involved confidential information about TechFlow's strategic plans that couldn't be shared with outside parties. The irony of being classified as an outside party in my own husband's business was not lost on me, but what really stung was David's easy acceptance of these restrictions. He never questioned whether Robert's confidentiality concerns were legitimate, or whether excluding me from business discussions was appropriate given how much work I had already put into understanding his clients' needs. Instead, he seemed relieved to have a clear boundary that would prevent any awkward situations where my presence might create tension with his most important client. Robert's influence over David became more apparent as the months progressed. David started adopting Robert's opinions about everything from marketing strategies to industry trends, often contradicting positions he had held just weeks earlier. When I pointed out these inconsistencies during our private conversations, David would become defensive and explain that Robert's experience gave him insights that weren't immediately obvious to people outside the industry. It was becoming clear that Robert was not just David's client, but was positioning himself as David's mentor and guide, a role that left no room for input from anyone else. The situation reached a turning point during a networking event at the Austin Convention Center, where David was presenting a case study about TechFlow's recent marketing success. I had helped him research and prepare the presentation, contributing analysis and strategic insights that had significantly strengthened his argument. But when Robert introduced David to the audience, he made sure to emphasize that the successful campaign had been the result of TechFlow's innovative approach and David's skilled execution, with no mention of the collaborative process that had actually created the strategy. During the presentation, David used several insights and analytical frameworks that I had developed, but he presented them as his own ideas, without any acknowledgement of their actual source. This wasn't necessarily malicious on David's part. In his mind, the ideas had become part of his thinking through our discussions, and he probably didn't even remember their original source. But watching him receive applause and congratulations for work that I had significantly contributed to was a painful reminder of how invisible my contributions had become. After the presentation, Robert made a point of praising David's analysis, while also making subtle comments about how impressive it was that David had developed such sophisticated strategic thinking entirely on his own. The implication was clear: any suggestion that David might have had help or collaboration in developing his insights would diminish the accomplishment and undermine his credibility as an independent consultant. Robert was ensuring that David understood the importance of maintaining the fiction that his success was entirely self-generated. The most devastating moment came during the reception, following the presentations, when I was introduced to several other business owners who were interested in David's services. Instead of presenting me as his partner in the business or even acknowledging my contributions to his work, David introduced me simply as his wife, who was very supportive of his career. When one of the potential clients asked if I was involved in the business side of his consultancy, David laughed and said that I preferred to focus on making our home life stable so that he could concentrate on serving his clients effectively. Robert, who was standing nearby during this conversation, nodded approvingly and added his own commentary about how important it was for entrepreneurs to have strong support systems that allowed them to focus entirely on their professional responsibilities. He made it sound like my lack of direct business involvement was not just appropriate but actually essential to David's success, as if any attempt on my part to participate more actively would inevitably create distractions that would harm his performance. Standing there listening to these two men discuss my role as if I were not present, I felt something crystallize inside me that had been building for months. I was tired of being treated as a supporting character in my own life, tired of having my ideas appropriated without credit, and tired of being dismissed as intellectually incapable by men who had never bothered to seriously engage with my thinking. But more than anything, I was tired of my own husband accepting and reinforcing these limitations rather than recognizing my potential as a true partner. That night, as David celebrated his successful presentation and the new client leads he had generated, I sat in our living room researching everything I could find about business software development and competitive analysis. I wasn't just browsing casually anymore, I was studying with the intensity of someone preparing for battle. Every article about market positioning, every case study about successful startups, every analysis of industry trends was another piece of ammunition in a war that Robert Chen didn't even know was coming. The mounting resistance I faced over the following months took forms that were often subtle but always consistent. Robert began making comments about how important it was for David to maintain professional boundaries and ensure that his business relationships remained clearly separated from his personal life. These weren't direct criticisms of me, but they created an atmosphere where any suggestion that I might become more involved in David's work was automatically seen as inappropriate boundary crossing. When I suggested that David might benefit from bringing in a business partner who could help with strategic analysis and client research, Robert immediately counseled against it, arguing that partnerships often led to conflicts and complications that could damage client relationships. He shared stories about other consultants who had made the mistake of bringing in partners too early and had ended up losing focus and credibility as a result. The message was clear: David's success depended on maintaining his independence and avoiding any arrangements that might dilute his authority or create confusion about who was actually responsible for delivering results. David began adopting Robert's perspective on this issue, explaining to me that while he appreciated my interest in his work, it was important for him to establish himself as the sole expert and decision-maker in his business relationships. Any hint that he was relying on outside input or collaboration might make clients question his capabilities and undermine the trust that was essential to his success. It was a rational argument that completely ignored the fact that my contributions had already improved his work significantly, and that hiding the collaborative nature of his process was actually a form of deception. The personal cost of this dynamic was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. I found myself editing my comments during dinner conversations, avoiding topics that might lead to business discussions where my opinions would be dismissed or ignored. When friends asked about my own career aspirations, I had learned to deflect with vague comments about supporting David's success and keeping my options open for the future. The intelligent, ambitious woman I had been in college was slowly disappearing, replaced by a careful, compliant version of myself that never challenged anyone's assumptions or expectations. But even as I played this diminished role in public, I was using my newfound free time to conduct an increasingly sophisticated analysis of the business software market and TechFlow's position within it. Every dismissive comment from Robert became motivation to dig deeper into industry research. Every assumption about my lack of capability became fuel for more intensive self-education. I was transforming my anger and frustration into a comprehensive understanding of exactly how I could prove everyone wrong. The skills I was developing through this research went far beyond anything I had learned in college or through my previous work experience. I was learning to think like a strategic analyst, identifying market gaps and competitive vulnerabilities with the precision of someone whose entire sense of self-worth depended on being absolutely correct. I studied TechFlow's financial reports, analyzed their client retention rates, researched their competitors' strengths and weaknesses, and developed detailed profiles of their target customers' unmet needs. What I discovered was that Robert's confidence in his company's market position was largely based on outdated assumptions about customer loyalty and competitive barriers. TechFlow had been successful primarily because they had entered the market early and had built relationships with clients who were reluctant to switch to newer alternatives. But their actual product offerings were becoming increasingly inadequate compared to what newer companies were developing, and their customer service was so poor that many clients were actively looking for reasons to make a change. The more I learned about TechFlow's vulnerabilities, the more confident I became that a well-designed competitor could successfully challenge their market dominance. They were charging premium prices for software that was no longer cutting edge, providing minimal customer support, and showing little interest in innovation or improvement. Most importantly, they had become complacent about customer satisfaction, assuming that the switching costs and relationship inertia would protect them from competitive threats indefinitely. Armed with this knowledge, I began developing detailed plans for how a new company could enter the market and systematically capture TechFlow's most valuable clients. The strategy would require superior technology, better customer service, more competitive pricing, and most importantly, a deep understanding of each client's specific needs and pain points. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted challenge that Robert claimed required the right type of mind to master. The final straw came during a dinner party at Robert and Monica's house, where several of Austin's most successful business owners had gathered to discuss industry trends and market opportunities. David and I had been invited as part of Robert's effort to introduce David to potential clients and establish him more firmly within Austin's business community. It should have been an exciting opportunity to network and build relationships that could help David's consultancy grow to the next level. Instead, it became the most humiliating experience of my entire marriage. Throughout the evening, Robert made sure to introduce David as a rising star in the marketing world, while introducing me simply as David's lovely wife. When conversations turned to business topics, I was consistently excluded or redirected to discussions about home decorating and charity work with the other wives present. It was as if there was an invisible but impermeable barrier separating the serious business discussions from the social chit-chat deemed appropriate for spouses. The breaking point came when one of the guests, a successful software entrepreneur named Kevin O'Brien, mentioned that he was looking for marketing support to help launch a new product line. This was exactly the kind of opportunity that David had been hoping for, a chance to work with an established company that could provide both significant revenue and valuable credibility within Austin's tech community. I could see David's excitement as Kevin described the project and the budget he had allocated for marketing support. But before David could respond, Robert intervened with what he clearly intended as a helpful gesture. He explained to Kevin that while David was certainly talented, this particular project might require more strategic sophistication than a newer consultant could provide. Robert suggested that Kevin might want to consider working with a more established firm that had experience with product launches in competitive markets, and he offered to provide some referrals to consultants who had proven track records with similar challenges. David's face fell as he realized that Robert was effectively undermining his chances of landing this significant client, but he was too dependent on Robert's support and referrals to challenge the assessment directly. Instead, he nodded politely and agreed that Kevin should certainly explore all his options before making a decision. I watched this exchange in stunned silence, realizing that Robert was not just dismissive of my capabilities, but was actively working to limit David's opportunities as well. Later that evening, as we drove home in silence, I understood that Robert's control over David's business was far more complete than I had realized. He wasn't just a client or even a mentor, he had positioned himself as the gatekeeper for David's professional opportunities within Austin's business community. Any challenge to Robert's authority or judgment could result in not just the loss of TechFlow's business, but the loss of access to the network of relationships that Robert controlled. This realization was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that David would never be able to stand up to Robert's dismissive treatment of me without risking his entire career. But liberating because it finally made clear that the only way to prove my worth was to compete directly with Robert on his own terms, in his own industry, using capabilities that he was convinced I didn't possess. That night, I made the final decision to build a company that would systematically destroy TechFlow's market position while proving definitively that the woman Robert had dismissed as intellectually incapable was actually his most formidable competitor. The complete breakdown of my faith in David's ability to see or support my potential was the catalyst I needed to stop seeking validation from others and start creating my own path to success. The psychological preparation for what I was about to undertake required a fundamental shift in how I thought about myself and my capabilities. For years I had accepted other people's assessments of my limitations and had tried to find fulfillment within the boundaries they had established for me. But Robert's consistent dismissal, and David's passive acceptance of it had finally pushed me beyond the point where I could continue living within those constraints. I began to understand that the anger and frustration I had been feeling were actually valuable sources of energy that could be channeled into building something extraordinary. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every assumption about my lack of capability became fuel for the most ambitious project I had ever conceived. I was going to prove that not only could I understand the complexities of business strategy, but I could execute those strategies more effectively than the men who had spent years underestimating. The complete breakdown of my traditional role as the supportive wife was about to become the foundation for my emergence as a formidable entrepreneur and competitor. Robert Chen had no idea that his casual dismissal of my potential was about to cost him everything he had worked to build, but I was finally ready to show him exactly what the right type of mind could accomplish when it was properly motivated. The transformation from devastated wife to determined entrepreneur began in the most unlikely place, our kitchen table at 3 a.m, surrounded by printouts of TechFlow's public financial statements and industry reports I had been secretly collecting for weeks. The house was completely silent, except for the gentle hum of our refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood, but my mind was racing with possibilities that had never seemed real before that night. For the first time in my adult life, I was asking myself not what I was supposed to do or what others expected of me, but what I was actually capable of accomplishing if I stopped accepting other people's limitations. The revelation that would change everything came as I was analyzing TechFlow's customer satisfaction surveys, documents that Robert had carelessly left in David's briefcase after their last meeting. What I discovered was a pattern of complaints that had been consistent for over 2 years, but had apparently been ignored by TechFlow's management team. Clients were reporting the same issues repeatedly: confusing user interfaces, slow response times for technical support, billing errors that took months to resolve, and software updates that often created more problems than they solved. These weren't minor inconveniences that could be addressed with small improvements to existing systems. They were fundamental design flaws that revealed a company that had lost touch with its customers' actual needs and had become more focused on maintaining profit margins than delivering value. Most tellingly, several clients had specifically mentioned that they would be willing to pay more for software that actually worked as promised, suggesting that TechFlow's problems weren't related to pricing pressure but to basic competence in product development and customer service. As I read through complaint after complaint, I began to see not just TechFlow's weaknesses, but a comprehensive blueprint for how a competitor could systematically address every pain point that Robert's company had created through years of neglect and complacency. The customers were essentially providing a detailed specification for exactly what they wanted from a business software provider, and TechFlow was either unable or unwilling to deliver on those requirements. The spark of revolutionary thinking came when I realized that I already understood these customer needs better than Robert did, simply because I had been listening to David's complaints about TechFlow's shortcomings for months without dismissing them as unimportant. Every frustration David had shared about his clients' software problems, every workaround he had developed to compensate for TechFlow's limitations, every suggestion he had made for improvements that Robert had ignored became valuable intelligence about market opportunities that no one was currently addressing. But understanding the market opportunity was only the first step in what would need to be a comprehensive strategy for competing with an established company that had significant resources and existing customer relationships. I couldn't simply build a better product and expect customers to automatically switch, especially when many of them had invested considerable time and money in implementing TechFlow's systems. I would need to develop not just superior technology but a complete business model that made switching not just attractive but practically irresistible. The breakthrough insight came from studying how successful startups had disrupted other established industries, particularly cases where new companies had defeated larger competitors despite having fewer resources and less market experience. The pattern that emerged was clear: successful disruption required identifying customers who were most dissatisfied with existing solutions and offering them dramatically better value propositions that established companies couldn't or wouldn't match, due to their existing commitments and organizational constraints. TechFlow's vulnerability was that they had become dependent on serving large clients with complex needs and premium pricing, which made it difficult for them to adapt their offerings for smaller businesses that needed simpler solutions at lower price points. But the market research I had been conducting suggested that small and medium-sized businesses represented the fastest-growing segment of the business software market, and they were consistently underserved by companies like TechFlow that focused primarily on enterprise clients. This insight led to the revolutionary idea that would become the foundation of my entire strategy. Instead of trying to compete directly with TechFlow for their existing clients, I would build a company focused specifically on serving the market segment that TechFlow had essentially abandoned. By developing software that was specifically designed for smaller businesses with limited technical resources and tighter budgets, I could create a customer base that would be naturally resistant to TechFlow's eventual competitive responses. The elegance of this approach was that it would allow me to build market share and refine my product offerings without immediately threatening TechFlow's core business, which would buy me time to develop the capabilities needed for more direct competition later. Robert would likely dismiss my company as irrelevant to his market position until it was too late for him to respond effectively, especially given his obvious blind spots about market dynamics and customer needs. But turning this strategic insight into an actual business would require resources, expertise, and credibility that I simply didn't possess as an isolated housewife with no official business experience. I would need to find partners who could provide the technical skills and industry connections necessary to compete with established companies, and I would need to do this without revealing my plans to David or anyone else who might inadvertently alert Robert to what I was developing. The solution came from an unexpected source: the Austin Women Entrepreneurs Network, an organization I had joined months earlier under the pretense of developing social connections while David focused on building his business. I had been attending their monthly meetings primarily as a way to get out of the house and have conversations with women who had professional ambitions beyond supporting their husbands' careers. But I had never seriously considered that these connections might become the foundation for my own business venture. At the next network meeting, I decided to test the waters by presenting my market analysis as a theoretical case study about opportunities in the business software industry. I framed my presentation as academic research I had been conducting to better understand David's clients' needs, carefully avoiding any mention of my actual plans to build a competing company. The response was immediately encouraging. Several women who ran their own businesses confirmed that they had experienced exactly the problems I had identified and would be interested in alternatives that addressed those issues more effectively. More importantly, I met Jennifer Walsh, a software developer who had recently left a senior position at a major technology company to start her own consulting practice. Jennifer had become frustrated with the corporate environment's resistance to innovation and was looking for opportunities to work on projects that would allow her to develop cutting-edge solutions without the bureaucratic constraints she had faced in larger organizations. When I described the market opportunity I had identified, she immediately understood both the technical challenges and the business potential involved. Jennifer's enthusiasm for the project was exactly the validation I needed to move from theoretical analysis to practical planning. During our first private meeting at a coffee shop in South Austin, I shared more details about my research and the specific product features I thought would be necessary to compete effectively in the market I had identified. Jennifer not only confirmed that these features were technically feasible, but suggested several additional innovations that could give us significant advantages over existing solutions. The most important aspect of our collaboration was that Jennifer brought not just technical expertise, but also a network of other professionals who had become disillusioned with working for larger companies and were interested in joining startups that offered more creative freedom and equity participation. Within 2 weeks of our initial conversation, she had identified 3 other developers who would be willing to work on our project in exchange for equity stakes and the opportunity to build something innovative from the ground up. The transformation from isolated frustration to collaborative excitement was intoxicating in ways I hadn't experienced since college. For months I had been analyzing market opportunities and developing strategic insights in complete isolation, never sure whether my thinking was sound or whether I was simply deluding myself about my capabilities. But working with Jennifer and her network of technical professionals provided immediate confirmation that my analysis was not only correct but had identified opportunities that experienced industry professionals found genuinely compelling. Our weekly planning meetings became the highlight of my week, providing intellectual stimulation and creative challenge that had been completely absent from my daily life. Jennifer would explain the technical aspects of different development approaches while I outlined the business case for various features and mapped out potential customer acquisition strategies. We complemented each other perfectly, and within a month we had developed a comprehensive plan for building a software platform that would systematically address every shortcoming we had identified in TechFlow's current offerings. The next challenge was securing the initial funding needed to support our development work without raising suspicions about how I was spending money or time. I couldn't ask David for startup capital without revealing my plans, and I didn't have enough personal savings to cover the costs of hiring developers and renting office space. The solution required a level of financial creativity that would have been unthinkable to me just months earlier, but my determination to prove my capabilities had given me courage to take risks I would never have considered before. The breakthrough came when I remembered my grandmother's jewelry collection, which had been sitting in a safety deposit box since she passed away 3 years earlier. The pieces had significant sentimental value, but they represented the only substantial assets I owned independently of my marriage to David. After having the collection appraised, I discovered it was worth approximately $60,000, which would be enough to cover our initial development costs and provide several months of runway while we built our minimum viable product. Selling my grandmother's jewelry felt like crossing a psychological threshold that separated my old life from whatever I was about to become. These weren't just valuable objects, they were the last physical connection to a woman who had always encouraged my independence and intellectual curiosity. But as I handed the pieces over to the jewelry dealer, I realized that my grandmother would have understood exactly what I was trying to accomplish and would have supported my decision to invest in my own potential rather than preserving symbols of the past. The $60,000 went into a business account I opened under my maiden name, with all correspondence directed to a private mailbox I rented specifically for Innovate Tech Lab's business. This financial infrastructure allowed me to pay Jennifer and her development team while maintaining complete separation between my startup activities and my domestic life with David. Every transaction was carefully planned to avoid creating paper trails that might accidentally be discovered during our joint financial planning or tax preparation. While Jennifer's team worked on developing our core software platform, I threw myself into market research and customer development with the intensity of someone whose entire sense of self-worth depended on proving a fundamental point about human potential. I attended every relevant industry conference and networking event in Austin, presenting myself as an independent consultant conducting market research for various clients. This cover story allowed me to gather detailed intelligence about customer needs and competitive dynamics without revealing my actual intentions to anyone who might have connections to Robert or TechFlow. The most valuable insights came from informal conversations with small business owners who were struggling with their current software solutions but felt trapped by switching costs and implementation complexity. Many of them expressed frustration with companies like TechFlow that seemed more interested in serving large enterprise clients than addressing the specific needs of smaller businesses. They wanted software that was intuitive enough to use without extensive training, reliable enough to depend on for daily operations, and affordable enough to fit within limited technology budgets. What became clear through these conversations was that the market opportunity I had identified was even larger than my initial analysis had suggested.
There were thousands of small businesses in the Austin area alone that were underserved by existing software providers, and many of them were actively looking for alternatives that would better meet their needs. The challenge wasn't finding potential customers, it was building the credibility and trust necessary to convince them to take a chance on a new company with no track record. This challenge led to another crucial insight about how to structure our go-to-market strategy. Instead of trying to compete directly with TechFlow from the beginning, we would need to build our reputation and refine our product offerings by serving clients who were too small or specialized for TechFlow to pursue profitably. Success with these initial clients would provide both the revenue and the credibility necessary to eventually compete for larger accounts, including some of TechFlow's existing customers who were dissatisfied with their current service levels. The development process took longer than I had initially anticipated, primarily because we were committed to building software that was genuinely superior to existing alternatives rather than simply cheaper or more convenient. Jennifer's team was essentially rebuilding business software architecture from the ground up, incorporating modern design principles and user experience standards that companies like TechFlow had never bothered to implement. Every feature was carefully designed to address specific pain points that we had identified through our customer research, and every interface element was tested with actual small business owners to ensure it met their practical needs. The stress of maintaining this double life while managing the complex challenges of software development pushed me to psychological limits I hadn't known existed. Every conversation with David required careful attention to what I could and couldn't reveal about how I was spending my time and money. When he asked about my day, I had to remember which version of events I had already shared and ensure my stories remained internally consistent. When Robert came to our house for dinner meetings, I had to sit silently while he complained about competitive pressures and market challenges, knowing that I was actively working to become one of those pressures he was worried about. The closest I came to discovery was during a particularly intense development phase when I accidentally left some technical specifications on our kitchen counter while rushing to meet Jennifer for an emergency debugging session. David found the papers when he came home from work and spent several minutes studying diagrams that showed database architecture and user authentication protocols far more sophisticated than anything a casual hobbyist would need to understand. When he asked about them, I claimed
They were example materials Jennifer had shown me to help illustrate how professional software development projects were structured. David accepted this explanation, but I could see curiosity in his expression that made me realize I needed to be much more careful about maintaining the separation between my startup activities and my domestic life. From that point forward, all Innovate Tech Labs materials stayed in the small office space I had rented in a co-working facility downtown, where I could work without worrying about accidentally leaving evidence where David might discover it. The first breakthrough came approximately 8 months into our development process, when Jennifer's team completed a working beta version of our core platform that addressed all the major functional requirements we had identified through our market research. The software was faster, more intuitive, and more reliable than anything TechFlow was currently offering, and it included several innovative features that would be impossible for larger companies to implement quickly due to their legacy system constraints. Our initial testing with a small group of friendly business owners exceeded every expectation I had dared to develop. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with users consistently commenting on how much easier our software was to use compared to their previous solutions. More importantly, several testers volunteered to serve as references for other potential customers and expressed interest in investing in our company once we were ready to raise formal funding rounds. The validation from these early users provided exactly the confidence boost I needed to move from stealth development mode to active customer acquisition. We were ready to start competing directly with TechFlow for real clients, armed with superior technology and a deep understanding of market needs that Robert's company had consistently ignored. The woman who had been dismissed as intellectually incapable of understanding business strategy was about to prove exactly how wrong that assessment had been. But scaling from a successful prototype to a real business would require navigating challenges that were far more complex than anything I had faced during the development phase. We would need to hire additional team members, establish proper business operations, develop marketing and sales processes, and most importantly, maintain our competitive advantage while larger companies like TechFlow began to notice our success and potentially develop responses to our market entry. The most immediate challenge was building a sales and marketing capability that could effectively communicate our value proposition to potential customers while establishing the credibility necessary to compete with established companies. Most small business owners were naturally risk-averse when it came to adopting new software solutions, especially from companies they had never heard of. And overcoming this skepticism would require a level of professional polish and strategic sophistication that we had never needed during the development phase. Jennifer suggested that we needed to hire someone with proven experience in business software sales, preferably someone who understood both the technical aspects of our platform and the practical concerns of small business owners. The challenge was finding someone with the right combination of skills and experience who would be willing to join a startup that was still largely unknown in the market and was directly competing with established companies like TechFlow. The solution came through the Austin Women Entrepreneurs Network, where I met Lisa Park, a sales professional who had spent 5 years working for a business software company before leaving to start her own consulting practice. Lisa had become frustrated with her previous employer's focus on serving large enterprise clients and was looking for opportunities to work with companies that were genuinely committed to serving small businesses more effectively. When I explained our mission and demonstrated our platform's capabilities, Lisa immediately understood both the market opportunity and the competitive advantage we had developed. More importantly, she brought a network of potential customers and industry contacts that would dramatically accelerate our customer acquisition timeline. Within 2 weeks of joining our team, she had scheduled demonstrations with 12 potential clients and had identified several industry partnerships that could provide ongoing sources of qualified leads. The combination of superior technology, deep market understanding, and experienced sales leadership created a foundation for rapid growth that exceeded every projection I had developed during our planning phase. We were no longer just building a product, we were building a company that could legitimately challenge TechFlow's market position and prove that innovation and customer focus could triumph over established relationships and brand recognition. The success of our early sales efforts brought both exhilaration and new anxieties about maintaining secrecy, while our business grew beyond what could be easily hidden from David or anyone else in Austin's interconnected business community. Every new client represented validation of our strategy and progress toward financial independence, but also increased the risk that someone would eventually make connections that would reveal my involvement in what was rapidly becoming TechFlow's most serious competitive threat. The psychological transformation from frustrated housewife to confident entrepreneur was accelerating as rapidly as our business growth, but it was also creating internal tensions about the sustainability of living such fundamentally different identities in public and private settings. The woman who was successfully leading a technology startup was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with the supportive wife who listened patiently to David's work complaints and offered encouraging words when Robert made unreasonable demands. But every small victory in building Innovate Tech Labs reinforced my determination to see this strategy through to its ultimate conclusion. I was no longer just trying to prove a point about my own capabilities. I was building something that would fundamentally reshape the competitive dynamics of Austin's business software industry while demonstrating that innovation and customer focus could triumph over complacency and established relationships. Robert Chen had no idea that his casual dismissal of my intellectual potential was about to cost him everything he had worked to build. The phone call that would test everything I had built came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly projections in my downtown office. Lisa had just finished presenting our latest sales numbers to the team, and the results were beyond anything we had projected during our most optimistic planning sessions. Innovate Tech Labs had acquired 43 clients in the past 6 months, generating over $2 million in annual recurring revenue and establishing ourselves as a legitimate force in Austin's business software market. But success had also made us visible to competitors who had previously ignored our existence. Jennifer burst into my office without knocking, her face pale and her hands shaking as she held up her laptop screen. "Sarah, you need to see this immediately," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. On her screen was a press release from TechFlow Solutions announcing the launch of Flexi Business Pro, a new software platform specifically designed for small and medium-sized businesses. The product description read like a point-by-point response to every competitive advantage we had spent months developing, complete with pricing that was clearly designed to undercut our market position. The announcement was devastating not just because it represented direct competition, but because it revealed that Robert had finally recognized the threat we posed and was mobilizing TechFlow's considerable resources to crush us before we could become established enough to survive a prolonged competitive battle. The timing was particularly brutal, coming just weeks before we had planned to announce our own Series A funding round that would have given us the capital needed to accelerate our growth and defend our market position. What made the situation even more terrifying was the realization that Robert's new product launch was being supported by a marketing campaign that directly targeted our existing clients with offers that were specifically designed to exploit our vulnerabilities as a newer company. TechFlow was offering 12 months of free software migration services, extended warranties, and pricing guarantees that we simply couldn't match with our current resources. They were essentially using their established market position and deep pockets to make switching away from Innovate Tech Labs financially irresistible for customers who might be concerned about our long-term viability. The press release also revealed something that sent chills through my entire body. TechFlow had hired Marcus Webb, a prominent business software executive who had previously worked for 3 of our potential competitors. Marcus was known throughout the industry for his expertise in identifying and neutralizing emerging competitive threats, and his hiring suggested that Robert was taking our challenge seriously enough to bring in specialized talent specifically focused on destroying our business. Within hours of TechFlow's announcement, our phones began ringing with calls from existing clients who wanted to understand how we planned to respond to this new competitive pressure. Several expressed concerns about whether Innovate Tech Labs would be able to survive a direct confrontation with a company that had significantly more resources and market experience. 2 of our largest clients requested emergency meetings to discuss whether they should consider switching to TechFlow's new platform despite their satisfaction with our current service levels. The psychological pressure of facing this existential threat while maintaining my secret identity became almost unbearable. That evening, David came home excited about a new project Robert had offered him, specifically focused on supporting the marketing launch of Flexi Business Pro. David was thrilled about the opportunity to work on such a high-profile campaign and spent the entire dinner describing the competitive intelligence research he would be conducting to identify and neutralize TechFlow's emerging competitors. Listening to my own husband enthusiastically planning strategies to destroy the company I had built was surreal beyond anything I could have imagined. David was literally being paid to gather information about my business operations and develop tactics to steal our clients, all while having no idea that the competitor he was targeting was sitting across the dinner table from him. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes hadn't been so devastatingly high. The next morning brought even worse news when Lisa called to report that 3 more clients had canceled their contracts, citing concerns about our ability to compete with TechFlow's new offering. The cancellations represented nearly $400,000 in annual revenue and created immediate cash flow problems that threatened our ability to meet payroll and maintain our development schedule. We were facing the classic startup death spiral, where competitive pressure creates customer defections that reduce resources needed to compete effectively, leading to more defections and eventual business failure. But the crisis also clarified something fundamental about my own determination and strategic thinking that had been developing throughout this entire journey. Instead of panicking or considering surrender, I found myself analyzing TechFlow's response with the cold calculation of someone who had been preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. Robert's competitive strategy revealed several critical weaknesses that could be exploited by a company willing to take calculated risks and think more creatively than established players typically could. The most significant vulnerability was that TechFlow's new product was clearly a rushed response to our market success rather than a carefully planned innovation. The feature set was impressive on paper, but our technical analysis revealed that they had essentially combined existing modules from their enterprise platform rather than building something specifically optimized for small business needs. This meant their solution would likely suffer from the same usability problems and performance issues that had made their other products frustrating for smaller clients to implement and maintain. More importantly, TechFlow's aggressive pricing strategy suggested they were treating this competitive response as a short-term campaign rather than a sustainable business model. The discounts and incentives they were offering would be impossible to maintain indefinitely without destroying their profit margins, which meant they were essentially betting that they could drive us out of business quickly enough to return to normal pricing before their own financial performance suffered significantly. This insight led to the strategic breakthrough that would ultimately save our company and transform it into something even more powerful than I had originally envisioned. Instead of trying to match TechFlow's pricing or competing directly with their marketing campaign, we would focus on the fundamental advantages that had made us successful in the first place. Superior customer service, more intuitive software design, and genuine commitment to solving small business problems rather than simply extracting maximum revenue from client relationships. The key was communicating these advantages to our clients and prospects in ways that made TechFlow's short-term pricing incentives seem less important than the long-term benefits of working with a company that truly understood their needs.
We developed a comprehensive client retention strategy that included personalized consultations with every existing customer, detailed comparisons between our platform and TechFlow's offering, and performance guarantees that demonstrated our confidence in delivering superior results. Jennifer's team worked around the clock to develop several innovative features that would be impossible for TechFlow to replicate quickly, given their legacy system constraints and bureaucratic decision-making processes. These weren't just cosmetic improvements, but fundamental enhancements to our core platform that would make switching to any competitor significantly less attractive for clients who had experienced our superior capabilities. The most important element of our competitive response was a comprehensive communications campaign that positioned the battle between Innovate Tech Labs and TechFlow as a choice between innovation and stagnation, between customer focus and corporate greed, between supporting local entrepreneurship and rewarding established complacency. We weren't just selling software, we were selling a vision of how business relationships should work in an industry that had become too focused on extracting value rather than creating it. The emotional and psychological toll of managing this crisis while maintaining my double life pushed me beyond every limit I thought I possessed. During the day, I was leading strategy sessions and client meetings with the intensity of someone fighting for their professional survival. During the evening, I was listening to David describe his research into our competitive vulnerabilities and his excitement about helping Robert develop tactics to destroy everything I had worked to build. The breaking point came when David brought home detailed market analysis that he had prepared for Robert, including specific intelligence about our client base, pricing strategies, and growth projections. The information was accurate enough to be genuinely damaging if TechFlow used it effectively, and it had been gathered by my own husband who had no idea he was providing ammunition to be used against his wife's secret business venture. Reading through David's research was like looking at my own company through the eyes of an enemy who understood our vulnerabilities better than I had realized. But it also provided invaluable insight into how TechFlow was thinking about the competitive battle and what strategies they were most likely to pursue in their efforts to neutralize our threat. In effect, David had inadvertently become my most valuable source of competitive intelligence about our primary opponent. The strategic advantage this created was unprecedented in business warfare. While Robert was developing tactics based on external analysis and industry assumptions, I had access to real-time intelligence about his specific plans and priorities. Every strategy session David attended, every piece of research he conducted, every conversation he had with Robert became valuable information that I could use to anticipate and counter TechFlow's competitive moves before they were fully implemented. But leveraging this advantage required a level of psychological compartmentalization that tested my sanity and my marriage in ways I had never anticipated. I had to listen to David describe tactics designed to destroy my life's work while appearing supportive and interested in his professional success. I had to ask thoughtful questions about his research while secretly analyzing how that same research could be used to protect my company from the attacks he was helping to plan. The unexpected breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. During one of David's dinner presentations about his competitive analysis, he mentioned that Robert was particularly concerned about Innovate Tech Labs' apparent ability to anticipate and counter TechFlow's strategic moves before they were fully implemented. Robert suspected that we had some kind of inside intelligence about his planning process, but he couldn't identify the source of our information advantage. This paranoia was actually creating problems within TechFlow's organization, as Robert had begun restricting access to strategic information and questioning the loyalty of employees who had access to sensitive competitive data. The internal tension was affecting TechFlow's ability to execute their competitive strategy effectively, as key team members were spending more time protecting themselves from suspicion than focusing on developing superior products or customer experiences. The irony was perfect. Robert's accurate suspicion that we had inside intelligence was creating exactly the kind of organizational dysfunction that would make it easier for us to compete successfully. His attempts to identify and eliminate our information advantage were actually creating new vulnerabilities that we could exploit to maintain our competitive position despite TechFlow's superior resources. The turning point in our competitive battle came when 3 major clients who had initially expressed interest in switching to TechFlow's new platform decided to remain with Innovate Tech Labs after experiencing our enhanced customer service and seeing demonstrations of our latest feature developments. These weren't just retention victories, they were validation that our fundamental strategy of competing on innovation and customer focus rather than pricing was more sustainable than TechFlow's aggressive but unsustainable discount campaign. More importantly, these client decisions began generating organic word-of-mouth marketing that was far more credible than any advertising campaign we could have afforded. Business owners who had personally compared our platform with TechFlow's offering were telling their peers that Innovate Tech Labs provided genuinely superior value despite being a newer company with fewer resources. This grassroots advocacy was exactly the kind of marketing advantage that established companies like TechFlow couldn't replicate simply by spending more money or hiring better consultants. The momentum shift became undeniable when Kevin O'Brien, the successful entrepreneur who had met Robert at that humiliating dinner party months earlier, contacted Lisa directly to schedule a demonstration of our platform. Kevin had initially signed up for TechFlow's new service based on Robert's personal recommendation, but had become frustrated with implementation problems and customer service issues that reflected all the institutional weaknesses we had identified in our original competitive analysis. During our presentation to Kevin's company, it became clear that we weren't just competing with TechFlow's product features, but with their entire approach to customer relationships. Kevin was impressed not just with our software capabilities, but with our responsiveness, our willingness to customize solutions for his specific needs, and our genuine interest in helping his business succeed rather than simply extracting maximum revenue from the relationship. When Kevin decided to switch from TechFlow to Innovate Tech Labs, bringing over $300,000 in annual revenue and serving as a reference for other potential clients, I knew we had survived the existential threat and were positioned to emerge stronger than before. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was psychological. We had proven that innovation and customer focus could triumph over established market position and superior resources when executed with sufficient determination and strategic sophistication. The transformation from defensive crisis management to offensive competitive advantage accelerated rapidly as other TechFlow clients began reaching out to explore alternatives. Robert's aggressive competitive response had actually highlighted the weaknesses in his company's customer service and product development that we had been designed specifically to address. By trying to compete with us on pricing while maintaining their fundamentally flawed approach to customer relationships, TechFlow was essentially helping us demonstrate why our alternative was superior. Within 6 months of TechFlow's competitive assault, Innovate Tech Labs had not only retained most of our existing clients, but had acquired 12 new ones, including 3 that had specifically switched from TechFlow's platform after experiencing the differences in service quality and product innovation. Our annual revenue had grown to over $4 million, and we were receiving inquiries from investors who were interested in funding our expansion into other markets. The success of our competitive response had attracted attention from industry analysts and business journalists who were beginning to write about Innovate Tech Labs as an example of how smaller companies could compete successfully with established players through superior customer focus and innovative thinking. Jennifer Walsh, a prominent business reporter for the Austin Business Journal, requested an interview with our CEO to discuss our competitive strategy and growth plans. The interview request created both an incredible opportunity and a terrifying risk. Media coverage could provide exactly the kind of credibility and market visibility we needed to accelerate our growth and attract additional investment, but it would also make it impossible to maintain the secrecy that had protected my double life for the past 2 years. If I appeared in a published interview as the CEO of Innovate Tech Labs, David would immediately discover that his wife had been building a direct competitor to his most important client while listening to his strategic planning sessions and market research. But the opportunity was too significant to decline, and I realized that my success had reached a point where continued secrecy was probably impossible anyway. Innovate Tech Labs had become too visible and too successful to hide from Austin's interconnected business community indefinitely. The choice was between controlling the revelation of my identity by participating in positive media coverage, or waiting for someone to accidentally discover the connection and potentially frame it in less favorable terms. I agreed to the interview, but requested that it be scheduled for the following week to give me time to prepare for the personal and professional consequences of revealing my identity. The next 7 days would require careful planning for how to tell David about my secret business venture and how to manage the inevitable confrontation with Robert when he discovered that the competitor who had been systematically undermining his market position was actually the wife of his marketing consultant. The conversation with David was the most difficult discussion of our entire marriage, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I explained what I had been building for the past 2 years and why I had felt it necessary to keep it secret, David's initial shock quickly gave way to a mixture of admiration and guilt about his role in creating the circumstances that had driven me to such elaborate deception. He acknowledged that he had consistently dismissed my business insights and had allowed Robert to treat me with disrespect that he should have challenged directly. More importantly, he recognized that my success with Innovate Tech Labs proved that his assessment of my capabilities had been completely wrong, and that his failure to take me seriously had nearly cost us both the opportunity to build something extraordinary together. David's response to learning about my secret business venture was far more supportive than I had dared to hope. Instead of feeling betrayed or threatened by my success, he expressed genuine pride in what I had accomplished and offered to help however he could with managing the transition from stealth mode to public recognition. His first suggestion was that he should immediately terminate his consulting relationship with TechFlow to avoid any potential conflicts of interest or ethical complications. The revelation conversation also provided an opportunity to discuss how we wanted to structure our relationship going forward, both personally and professionally. We agreed that Innovate Tech Labs would remain entirely my venture, with David providing informal advice and support but maintaining his independent consulting practice focused on other clients. This arrangement would allow us to collaborate when appropriate while ensuring that my business success wasn't diminished by assumptions about his involvement or contributions. Preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Robert required strategic thinking about how to manage the public relations aspects of our competitive relationship and my dramatic identity revelation. I wanted to ensure that the story was framed in terms of entrepreneurial success and innovative thinking rather than deception or betrayal, and I wanted to avoid any narrative that might suggest my business success was somehow illegitimate or unfair. The Austin Business Journal interview was scheduled for Tuesday morning at our downtown office, where Jennifer Walsh would have the opportunity to see our operation firsthand and speak with team members about our company culture and competitive strategy. I spent the weekend preparing for questions about our business model, growth plans, and competitive positioning, but I also prepared for the personal questions about my background and motivations that would inevitably arise once my identity became public. Monday evening brought the phone call I had been both anticipating and dreading for months. Robert had somehow learned about the upcoming interview, possibly through connections in Austin's business media community, and had called David to demand an immediate explanation for how his wife had become the CEO of TechFlow's primary competitor without his knowledge. The conversation was brief and brutal, ending with Robert's announcement that he was terminating his consulting relationship with David effective immediately and would be reviewing his legal options regarding the competitive intelligence that might have been shared inappropriately. David handled the call with remarkable composure, acknowledging Robert's anger while refusing to accept responsibility for my independent business decisions or apologize for my success. He made it clear that Innovate Tech Labs had been built entirely without his knowledge or involvement, and that any suggestion of improper information sharing was both unfounded and insulting. By the time he hung up, David had essentially burned the bridge with his most important client in order to defend my integrity and business achievements. The interview with Jennifer Walsh exceeded every expectation I had developed for how this revelation would be received by Austin's business community. Instead of focusing on the secrecy or deception aspects of my story, she was fascinated by the strategic thinking and competitive analysis that had enabled a complete
industry outsider to build a successful software company while established players like TechFlow failed to recognize emerging market opportunities. Her questions focused on the business lessons that could be learned from our success, how we had identified underserved market segments, how we had developed superior customer service capabilities, how we had built a company culture that prioritized innovation over tradition, and how we had competed successfully against larger competitors through superior execution rather than superior resources. The narrative that emerged was exactly what I had hoped for, a story about entrepreneurial vision and competitive excellence rather than corporate espionage or marital deception. The article was published the following Thursday with a headline that perfectly captured the essence of our journey: Local Entrepreneur Builds $1 Million Software Company by Focusing on What Established Competitors Ignored. The accompanying photograph showed me in our downtown office, surrounded by the team that had helped transform my initial frustration into a thriving business that was reshaping Austin's competitive landscape. The response to the article was immediate and overwhelmingly positive, with multiple inquiries from potential investors, partnership opportunities from other business software companies, and interview requests from national business publications that were interested in our competitive strategy and growth story. Most importantly, the article generated dozens of inquiries from potential clients who were attracted by our reputation for innovation and customer service excellence. Robert's response to the article was as predictable as it was ineffective. Within hours of its publication, he issued a press release claiming that Innovate Tech Labs had gained unfair competitive advantages through access to confidential tech flow information, and threatening legal action to protect his company's intellectual property and client relationships. The statement was clearly written in anger and reflected exactly the kind of defensive thinking that had made TechFlow vulnerable to competitive challenges in the first place. The business community's reaction to Robert's accusations was swift and largely unsympathetic. Several industry analysts pointed out that TechFlow's competitive problems were the result of their own complacency and customer service failures rather than any unfair advantages enjoyed by their competitors. More damaging to Robert's credibility, several former TechFlow clients publicly supported Innovate Tech Labs and confirmed that their decisions to switch providers had been based on product quality and service excellence rather than any inside information about TechFlow's operations. The ultimate irony came 2 weeks later when Kevin O'Brien, the entrepreneur who had been present at that humiliating dinner party where Robert first dismissed my business capabilities, published a LinkedIn post describing his experience switching from TechFlow to Innovate Tech Labs. Kevin specifically mentioned that conversation as an example of how established business leaders often fail to recognize emerging talent and competitive threats, and he praised my company's success as validation that innovation and customer focus would always triumph over arrogance and complacency. The legal threats that Robert had made in his angry press release never materialized, probably because any serious investigation would have revealed that Innovate Tech Labs had been built entirely through legitimate market research and superior execution rather than any improper access to confidential information. More importantly, pursuing legal action would have required Robert to acknowledge publicly that a company built by someone he had dismissed as intellectually incapable had successfully competed with his established business through superior strategic thinking and customer service. 6 months after my identity revelation, Innovate Tech Labs was acquired by Meridian Systems, a major business software company that wanted to expand their small business offerings and was impressed by our customer retention rates and growth trajectory. The acquisition price was $12 million, with additional performance bonuses that could bring the total value to over $15 million if we continued meeting our growth targets under Meridian's ownership. The acquisition announcement included quotes from Meridian's CEO praising our innovative approach to customer service and our ability to identify market opportunities that larger companies had overlooked. But the most satisfying part of the announcement was the biography section that described my background and the strategic vision that had driven Innovate Tech Lab's success, making it clear that this achievement belonged entirely to the woman who had been systematically underestimated by everyone who thought they understood her potential. The evening after the acquisition announcement, David and I celebrated at the same restaurant where Robert had made his dismissive comments about my business capabilities 2 years earlier. As we toasted our success and discussed our plans for the future, I reflected on how his casual cruelty had inadvertently provided exactly the motivation I needed to prove that his assessment of my potential had been completely wrong. The most profound change wasn't financial, though the acquisition had certainly provided security and opportunities that we had never imagined possible. The real transformation was psychological. I had proven to myself that I possessed capabilities and strategic insight that went far beyond anything others had recognized or that I had even believed about myself. The woman who had been dismissed as a supportive housewife had built and sold a technology company that generated millions in revenue and employed over 20 people. Looking back on the entire journey, I realized that Robert's dismissive attitude and David's passive acceptance of it had actually been gifts in disguise, providing exactly the external pressure needed to push me beyond comfortable boundaries and discover what I was actually capable of accomplishing. Without that initial humiliation and ongoing disrespect, I might never have developed the determination and strategic focus necessary to compete successfully in an industry where I had no experience or established credibility. The story of Innovate Tech Labs became a case study in several business schools about how emerging companies can compete successfully with established players through superior customer focus and innovative thinking. But for me, it will always be a reminder that the people who dismiss your potential are often providing exactly the motivation you need to exceed every limitation they tried to impose on your dreams and aspirations. The Austin Tech Summit had always been the most prestigious technology conference in Central Texas, attracting industry leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs from across the region. This year's theme was Innovation Beyond Boundaries, and the keynote speaker lineup included some of the most influential voices in business software development. What the audience didn't know was that the final presentation of the evening would deliver the most shocking revelation in the conference's 15-year history. I stood backstage at the Austin Convention Center, wearing a navy blue business suit that projected exactly the kind of authority and confidence I had spent 3 years building from nothing. The acquisition of Innovate Tech Labs by Meridian Systems had been announced just that morning, making headlines in every major business publication and establishing me as one of Austin's most successful female entrepreneurs. But tonight's presentation would be about more than business success. It would be about the power of vision over prejudice and the dangers of underestimating people based on outdated assumptions about their capabilities. The conference organizers had invited me to share the story of how Innovate Tech Labs had disrupted the business software industry through innovative customer focus and strategic thinking that established competitors had failed to recognize or counter effectively. What they didn't realize was that my presentation would also reveal the most ironic twist in Austin's recent business history: the identity of the entrepreneur who had systematically dismantled TechFlow Solutions' market position while sitting across the dinner table from their primary marketing consultant. As I reviewed my presentation notes one final time, I caught sight of David in the audience, beaming with pride that was both genuine and slightly complicated by the recognition that he had nearly missed recognizing the extraordinary woman he had married. Beside him sat several of our former clients, investors who had backed Innovate Tech Labs during our growth phase, and journalists who were covering the conference for various business publications. The audience represented exactly the kind of business community that had initially dismissed my potential but was now eager to understand how I had achieved such remarkable success. What made this moment particularly sweet was the knowledge that Robert Chen was somewhere in that same audience, forced to listen as the woman he had consistently dismissed as intellectually incapable explained the strategic thinking and competitive analysis that had destroyed his company's market dominance. According to David, Robert had tried to avoid attending the conference entirely, but TechFlow's board of directors had insisted that he be present to represent the company at an event where their primary competitor would be receiving such prominent recognition. The conference moderator's introduction was everything I could have hoped for, emphasizing not just Innovate Tech Labs' financial success, but the innovative approaches we had developed for serving underrepresented market segments that larger companies had ignored. She described our customer retention rates, our growth trajectory, and our recent acquisition as evidence of how entrepreneurial vision could create value even in highly competitive industries dominated by established players. But the most satisfying part of her introduction was the emphasis on how our success had been achieved through superior strategic thinking rather than superior resources. Taking the stage felt like the culmination of a journey that had transformed every aspect of my identity and capabilities. 3 years earlier, I had been a frustrated housewife whose business insights were dismissed by her own husband and ridiculed by his most important client. Tonight I was addressing an audience of industry leaders as the CEO of a company that had generated millions in revenue and revolutionized how business software companies approached customer service and product development. The presentation began with market analysis that demonstrated how established companies like TechFlow had created opportunities for disruption through complacency and customer neglect. I explained how Innovate Tech Labs had identified underserved market segments and developed solutions specifically designed to address pain points that larger competitors had consistently ignored. The audience was clearly impressed by the depth of strategic thinking and competitive analysis that had guided our business development, but they had no idea that this same analysis had been conducted by someone they would never have suspected of possessing such capabilities. As I moved through slides showing our customer acquisition strategies, product development timeline, and financial performance, I could see heads nodding throughout the audience as business leaders recognized the sophistication of approaches they had probably assumed were beyond the capabilities of a relatively new company. Several attendees were taking detailed notes, clearly hoping to apply similar strategies within their own organizations. The irony was that many of these same people had probably dismissed my potential during casual social interactions without ever realizing they were talking to someone who understood their industries better than they did. The turning point in the presentation came when I began discussing the personal motivation behind Innovate Tech Labs' founding and development. Instead of the typical entrepreneurial origin story about identifying market opportunities or pursuing childhood dreams, I described the experience of being consistently underestimated and dismissed by people who made assumptions about my capabilities based on traditional gender roles and social expectations rather than actual evidence of my strategic thinking abilities. The audience became noticeably more attentive as I explained how casual dismissal and intellectual condescension had provided exactly the motivation needed to prove that innovation and customer focus could triumph over established market position and superior resources. I could see people throughout the auditorium beginning to realize that this wasn't just a business success story, but a personal vindication narrative that challenged fundamental assumptions about who possesses entrepreneurial potential and strategic insight. The revelation began gradually, as I described specific examples of being excluded from business discussions and having my ideas appropriated without credit by men who assumed that their professional experience made them inherently more capable of understanding complex market dynamics. Several women in the audience were clearly relating to these experiences, nodding in recognition of similar treatment they had received in their own professional environments. But I could also see confusion and discomfort on some faces as people began wondering whether they might have been guilty of similar dismissive behavior toward women in their own business and social circles. The dramatic climax came when I displayed a slide showing the timeline of Innovate Tech Lab's development alongside major TechFlow Solutions announcements and marketing campaigns. The parallel presentation made it clear that our competitive success had been achieved not through luck or favorable market conditions, but through systematic analysis of our primary competitors' weaknesses and strategic development of solutions that addressed every shortcoming we had identified in their approach to customer service and product development. As the audience studied the timeline, I could see the moment when several people began making connections between Innovate Tech Lab's competitive intelligence and the marketing research that TechFlow had commissioned from various consultants throughout the same period. The realization was spreading through the auditorium like ripples in a pond as business leaders who were familiar with Austin's interconnected professional community began wondering how a startup with no industry connections had managed to anticipate and counter every competitive move that an established company had attempted. The final revelation came when I displayed a photograph from a dinner party at Robert and Monica Chen's house, showing David and me among the guests who had gathered to discuss industry trends and business opportunities. I explained how attending that dinner had provided crucial insights into TechFlow's strategic thinking and competitive blind spots, but I let the audience draw their own conclusions about how a marketing consultant's wife might have gained access to such valuable competitive intelligence. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and electric, as hundreds of business professionals simultaneously realized that they had just listened to a presentation by the woman who had been sitting quietly in the background during countless industry discussions while secretly building the most successful competitive threat that any of them had ever witnessed. The applause that eventually erupted was unlike anything I had experienced, reflecting not just appreciation for business success but genuine admiration for the strategic sophistication and psychological resilience required to accomplish what I had achieved. During the question and answer session that followed, the inquiries reflected the audience's fascination with both the business strategy and the personal journey that had made such remarkable success possible. Several entrepreneurs asked about specific tactical approaches we had used to compete with larger, better-funded competitors, while others wanted to understand how I had maintained the psychological stamina required to live such fundamentally different identities in public and private settings. The most meaningful question came from a young woman who identified herself as a recent MBA graduate struggling to be taken seriously in job interviews where potential employers seemed more interested in her appearance than her analytical capabilities. She asked whether I had ever doubted my own potential during the periods when others were consistently dismissing my ideas and contributions, and how I had maintained confidence in my strategic thinking despite the lack of external validation. My response emphasized that doubt and external dismissal had actually become valuable sources of motivation once I stopped seeking approval from people who were clearly incapable of recognizing potential that didn't conform to their limited expectations. I explained that building Innovate Tech Labs had required transforming frustration and anger into systematic analysis and strategic planning, channeling negative energy into positive action that would ultimately prove every critic wrong through measurable business results rather than arguments or explanations. The conference concluded with a networking reception where dozens of attendees approached me to discuss partnership opportunities, investment possibilities, and speaking engagements at other industry events. But the most satisfying conversation was with Marcus Webb, the business software executive whom TechFlow had hired specifically to neutralize emerging competitive threats like Innovate Tech Labs. Marcus acknowledged that he had underestimated both our strategic capabilities and our competitive intelligence advantages, and he expressed genuine admiration for the systematic way we had identified and exploited every weakness in TechFlow's market position.
Even more gratifying was the brief encounter with Robert Chen himself, who approached me near the end of the reception with an expression that reflected equal parts anger and grudging respect. Our conversation was awkward and stilted, but he did acknowledge that he had misjudged my business capabilities and admitted that Innovate Tech Labs had developed competitive advantages that TechFlow had been unable to counter effectively. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was recognition that his dismissive assessment of my potential had been completely wrong. The drive home with David provided an opportunity to reflect on how dramatically our relationship had evolved throughout this entire journey. Instead of the traditional dynamic where he shared his professional experiences while I listened supportively, we now had genuine conversations about business strategy, competitive analysis, and entrepreneurial challenges that drew on both of our expertise and perspectives. The partnership we had never quite achieved during the early years of his consulting practice had finally emerged through the success of my independent business venture. More importantly, David's attitude toward my contributions and capabilities had been fundamentally transformed by witnessing what I could accomplish when given the opportunity to operate without the constraints of others' expectations and assumptions. He no longer saw me as a supportive spouse who occasionally offered helpful suggestions, but as a strategic thinker and business leader whose insights and analysis were valuable in their own right. The woman he had married was finally visible to him in ways that had been impossible when he was viewing me through the lens of traditional gender roles and social expectations. The media coverage of my conference presentation exceeded every expectation I had developed for how this revelation would be received by the broader business community. Instead of focusing on the deception or secrecy aspects of my story, journalists were fascinated by the strategic thinking and competitive analysis that had enabled someone with no official business experience to outmaneuver established industry players who had dismissed her potential based on superficial assumptions. The narrative that emerged in subsequent articles and interviews was exactly what I had hoped for, a story about entrepreneurial vision and competitive excellence that challenged fundamental assumptions about who possesses business capability and strategic insight. Several business schools reached out to request case study materials about Innovate Tech Labs' competitive strategy, while women's business organizations invited me to speak about overcoming gender-based dismissal and discrimination in professional environments. The most unexpected outcome was the number of other women who contacted me to share similar experiences of being underestimated or dismissed by male colleagues and clients who made assumptions about their capabilities based on traditional gender roles rather than actual evidence of their strategic thinking abilities. Many of these women had developed innovative business ideas or identified market opportunities that were ignored or appropriated by men who assumed that professional experience automatically translated into superior analytical capabilities. These conversations led to the establishment of the Strategic Vision Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on supporting female entrepreneurs who were developing innovative business solutions but lacked access to traditional funding and mentorship networks. The foundation's mission was to provide both financial support and strategic guidance to women whose business potential was being overlooked by investors and industry leaders who couldn't see past their own assumptions about who possessed entrepreneurial capability. The foundation's first cohort included 12 women who had identified significant market opportunities in industries ranging from healthcare technology to sustainable manufacturing. Each had developed sophisticated business plans and competitive analysis that demonstrated genuine strategic insight, but had struggled to gain serious consideration from investors who were more comfortable funding entrepreneurs who fit traditional demographic profiles and background expectations. Working with these emerging entrepreneurs reminded me of my own journey from frustrated observer to successful business leader, and reinforced my conviction that innovation and competitive advantage often come from perspectives that established industry players are unable or unwilling to recognize. The foundation's success stories began generating additional media attention and investment interest, creating a virtuous cycle that was helping to expand opportunities for women whose potential had been consistently underestimated. 6 months after the Austin Tech Summit presentation, I received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at the National Women's Business Summit in Chicago, speaking to an audience of over 2,000 female entrepreneurs, business leaders, and investors. The speech provided an opportunity to share not just the tactical approaches that had made Innovate Tech Labs successful, but the psychological strategies that had enabled me to maintain confidence and strategic focus despite years of dismissal and condescension from people who should have been supporting my development. The response to that presentation led to a book contract for a business memoir that would explore the strategic thinking and competitive analysis that had guided Innovate Tech Labs' development, while also examining the broader implications of how gender assumptions and social expectations limit recognition of entrepreneurial potential. The book became a bestseller within 6 months of publication, resonating with women who had experienced similar dismissal while also challenging male business leaders to reconsider their assumptions about who possesses strategic capability and innovative thinking. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Harvard Business School invited me to serve as a visiting lecturer for their entrepreneurship program, specifically teaching courses on competitive strategy and market disruption. The irony of being invited to teach business strategy at one of the world's most prestigious business schools, after being dismissed as intellectually incapable by a man who measured everything by traditional credentials and institutional validation, was not lost on me. Standing in that Harvard lecture hall, addressing students who represented the future of business leadership, I often thought about Robert Chen and the casual certainty with which he had dismissed my potential based on his limited understanding of what strategic thinking looked like. His assessment had been wrong not just about my specific capabilities, but about the fundamental nature of innovation and competitive advantage in rapidly changing business environments. The students I taught were consistently impressed by the depth of analysis and strategic sophistication that had guided Innovate Tech Lab's competitive success, but they were equally interested in the psychological resilience and creative problem-solving that had been required to build a successful business while maintaining a secret identity. Many of them were struggling with their own experiences of being underestimated or dismissed by professors, potential employers, or family members who made assumptions about their potential based on demographic characteristics rather than actual evidence of their capabilities. These teaching experiences reinforced my conviction that the most dangerous form of discrimination isn't overt hostility or deliberate exclusion, but casual dismissal and condescending assumptions that prevent people from ever having the opportunity to demonstrate their actual potential. Robert's treatment of me hadn't been motivated by malice or conscious prejudice, but by unconscious assumptions about who possessed the right type of mind for strategic thinking and competitive analysis. The lasting impact of the Innovate Tech Lab story extends far beyond the financial success or business recognition that resulted from our competitive victory over TechFlow Solutions. The real achievement was demonstrating that innovation and strategic insight can emerge from the most unexpected sources when people are given genuine opportunities to develop and express their capabilities without the constraints of others' limiting assumptions and expectations. Today, when I meet young women who are struggling to be taken seriously in business environments where their contributions are consistently dismissed or appropriated by male colleagues, I share the fundamental lesson that Robert Chen inadvertently taught me: the people who underestimate your potential are often providing exactly the motivation you need to exceed every limitation they tried to impose on your dreams and aspirations. The woman who was once dismissed as a supportive housewife with no understanding of business complexity has become a recognized expert in competitive strategy and market disruption, proving that strategic thinking and entrepreneurial capability aren't limited to people who fit traditional demographic profiles or possess conventional business credentials. Sometimes the most profound insights come from perspectives that established players are unable or unwilling to recognize, and the most successful innovations emerge from individuals who have been systematically underestimated by people who confused credentials with capability. The ultimate irony of my journey is that Robert Chen's casual dismissal of my potential became the catalyst for achievements that exceeded anything he had accomplished in his own career. By underestimating my capabilities and dismissing my strategic insights, he inadvertently provided exactly the motivation needed to prove that innovation and competitive excellence can triumph over established market position and superior resources when guided by genuine vision and unwavering determination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.